the newsagents.
You know that moment when you change your phone, maybe upgrade your phone, change your handset, and you lose all your data. It's impossible to have any contacts, impossible to find any messages. You can't use the same apps anymore. All your emails just disappear.
Everything.
Yeah.
Gone.
Well, that is exactly what happened to poor old Rishi Sunak.
You don't now have access to any of the WhatsApps that you did send during the time of the crisis, do you?
No, I don't. I've changed my phone multiple times over the past few years, and as that has happened, the messages have not come across. As you said, I'm not a prolific user of WhatsApp in the first instance, primarily communication with my private office, and obviously anything that was of significance through those conversations or exchanges will have been recorded officially by my civil servants.
I'm now going to try a sound effect. That is me scratching my head because I'm not that tech savvy. I'm not a tech bro from California, nor an ex-Goldman Sachs banker. But I've changed my phone and never lost a single WhatsApp message. Weird, huh?
Schoolboy error. Welcome to the newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And we'll be coming to Rishi Sunak at the COVID inquiry a little bit later on, because he's been there all day, unable to focus on a small other little matter of boats crossing the channel and people not yet going to Rwanda.
You're talking about the Rwanda safety bill. I mean, trying to work out that title in my head. And the only thing it's got really to recommend it is that it's short. It's short enough to remember, but it doesn't really explain what they're going to be debating tomorrow in the Commons. What we do know is that today, large factions of the party, the Conservative Party, are all meeting in various different rooms to try and work out their own position vis-a-vis their own vote on whether to pass it through the Commons or not. So at 12 o'clock, just an hour and a half before we started recording this, there was a huddle amongst various factions, including the ERG, remember that sort of the strident Brexit grouping of the last Parliament, the ERG, the New Conservatives, anyone who I think would call themselves on the right of the party, has been invited to air their thoughts, concerns, grievances in a meeting. I'm going to say chaired by Suella. Might not have been chaired, but she was certainly prominent. And they basically reported back after the meeting ended with an opening statement that said they found the bill a partial and incomplete solution vulnerable to international law. What that doesn't tell us is how they will actually vote. And I've been calling round and I'm getting more of the I'm not quite decided or I haven't quite made up my mind yet than I have firm no's.
Yeah, so the statement goes on from them. The Prime Minister may well be right when he claims that this is the toughest piece of migrant legislation ever put forward by a UK government, but we do not believe that it goes far enough to deliver the policy as intending. And so they're not happy. Are they ever happy? But on that basis, I think Emily's absolutely right. And again, I've been hearing this as well, that if people are expecting tomorrow to be the big decisive showdown, is this the end of Rishi's premiership? Is this the kind of the coup de grace that will be delivered by the right of the Conservative Party or even the One Nation Conservatives? It's probably not. But there are battles still to come. And don't think that if Rishi doesn't lose tomorrow night, that he's in the clear, because I don't think he is in the clear, because I think there are still so many questions. And you can see the balancing act of Rishi Sunak being pulled to the right by the ERG and the New Conservatives and to the left by the One Nation Conservatives, who are fearful that this is just 1 inch away from going too far and Britain failing to meet its international obligations.
Exactly.
And that is the red line for the Liberal wing of the Conservative Party. On the right of the Conservative Party, they don't give a damn about that. They just want to see Britain somehow stopping the boats and doing whatever it takes to get these planes taking off to Rwanda.
Yeah, and just to talk you through the numbers, essentially it only takes 29 to vote against Rishi Sunak for him to lose the bill, which doesn't sound many, but I think it is probably unrealistically high at this point to say that 29 Tory MPs, who are all in favour of tighter migration, are going to vote against a bill which is still purporting to offer tighter immigration. But it could still be lost with enough abstentions. We're talking 70 abstentions with no one voting no, or 59, 60 abstentions with, let's say, 10 voting no, to actually lose in the bill. So there is a lot of talk, which is maybe why the meeting happened, about whether they let it pass this time round, they support it this time round, knowing that after Christmas, when it comes back, they can then amend it and add in their own specifications. But that is rubbing up against the Prime Minister, who's made it clear, not least to his former immigration minister who resigned last week, that he hasn't got any more wriggle room, that he actually can't offer them any more because he does not want to go further on breaking the limits of international law. And I think that's where it's going to be really kind of tight, maybe even divisive, between those on the right who say we've just got to stop it now because we can do better than this, and those on the right who say, let it pass this time round, we get our chance in a month's time. And of course, the One Nation Tories, don't forget another faction, who are meeting at around 6 o'clock tonight, who think it's way, way too hard and impossible to get through the courts anyway.
And the One Nation Tories, they're over 100 MPs. I mean, they're not a small faction. Right. They're not just a handful who are kind of the leftover Liberals from pre-Johnson days. They're a sizable chunk of the Conservative Party, and they are well represented in the cabinet as well, particularly following the reshuffle. But then Rishi Sunak has got himself caught on this hook, where he is saying Rwanda is all or nothing. And there's just a kind of feeling, and I was talking to some very senior Tories over the weekend who were saying, what on earth, James Cleverly was right. This is not the be-all and end-all. This is one part. Yeah, exactly. This is one small part of their overall policy to deal with kind of the upstream issues of immigration, the downstream issues of immigration, the push and pull factors involved in it. Why are we making Rwanda the litmus test, the virility test of how tough we are, when it's just, at its maximum, there are going to be 200 people going to Rwanda in a year, in the first year. It's tiny. It's an absolute pinprick. And yet this is becoming how Rishi Sunak's leadership will be judged.
Yeah, and I think if you look at who's talking at the One Nation group, and don't forget, they've got their own, KCs, lawyers, people who will be pointing out that this is really not a way for Britain to conduct itself on the international stage, if we want to be sort of taken seriously, not to go against our own human rights law, which is pretty much what Rishi Sunak suggested he was prepared to do in that press conference last week. And I think the most interesting person to watch at the moment is Victoria Prentice. She's the Attorney General. She will be addressing the One Nation group, but she herself expressed her reservations last week by saying that she did not feel comfortable at that point signing it into law because she recognises that it might not be compatible. And I think that will be a very, very interesting one to watch. She is obviously of the cabinet. She is obviously on Rishi Sunak's side in terms of collective responsibility, but she has got to try and find a way through what she feels as an Attorney General, as a lawyer, and what he is suggesting would happen to human rights violations if this went through.
And we've also got to consider the Labour Party in all of this, because the Labour Party are aware that at this stage of the Parliament, with a year kind of realistically maximum before you're going to have a general election, it's possible it could be January 2025, that what the government is in the
You're
business...
just throwing a sop to Lewis there. Who thinks that it's not going to be until...
Absent Lewis.
I think Lewis actually has now what we call hedged. He said it might be May with Rishi or it might be January with somebody else.
Yeah, well, so I've got the May sweepstake
You've
bet.
got the sweatshirt.
Exactly. But what the government is in the business of doing at the moment is trying to lay traps for the Labour Party to fall into. Let's lay an elephant trap over taxation and national insurance. Let's lay an elephant trap over immigration and dare you to vote against the bill that we are introducing to stop the small boats. And so, you have got Labour Party who will also want to be canny in the way that they oppose the government on this. At the moment, very happy to let the Conservatives be making the mistakes and getting itself tied in knots over it. But the Labour Party cannot be seen to somehow be soft on migration and as if it doesn't care, because I think that will be used in campaign literature between now and the next election.
Yeah, very soundly. In a moment, we're going to hear from the Tory MP and former Minister Paul Scully about what he thinks is shaping up ahead of that critical vote tomorrow.
Well, we're joined now in the studio by Paul Scully, Conservative MP, former Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, but also until last month a Minister and now on the backbenches. Thank you very much for being with us. Just as a starter question, is Rishi going to be all right? Is this vote on the boats going to get through and getting people on planes to Rwanda?
Look, I think in terms of the vote tomorrow, I think it should be okay. Logic would dictate he should be okay. Why is that? Because it's a second reading and a lot of people won't really understand the process in Parliament. But tomorrow is a debate about the principle of the bill. And I've heard no other reasons or reasonable things about what you can do instead of the Rwanda policy. And I think the party are largely agreeing with it. It's just how it gets done with the right and the left. So actually, logic would dictate that you actually, if you're going to object to stuff, you do that at committee stage when you go through line by line, and you might try and amend it in towards the right for the so-called Star Chamber, towards the left and soften it for the One Nation Conservatives. But tomorrow is just about the principle of the bill.
You described the ERG on the right, the One Nation's on the left. I mean,
of the party,
obviously. Of the party, yeah. But where are you?
I'm somewhere in the middle because, look, I think, as I say, I'll be voting for the bill tomorrow, not just because it's my government and I'm loyal to that government, but because, as I say, given where we are at the moment, I don't see any other option other than this policy going ahead, because if you don't have it, if you try and toughen it out or toughen it up even more, Rwanda would walk away from it. If you weaken it, then you just don't have an effective deterrent. That's what it's there to do.
And have you spoken, Paul, to those in the Thatcher Room meeting, the ERG members, since they came out? Because their opening statement says that they think it's a partial and incomplete solution vulnerable to international law. Now, clearly, that doesn't say they're not going to vote, but it does say that they don't really like it. Have you heard from them? What are the voices telling you?
I haven't spoken to them. I haven't been in Parliament yet today, but I have seen the statement that's come out. None of this is going to be perfect. If you're chasing perfection, we're back where we were a few years ago during the Brexit psychodrama, with everyone trying to unpick everything, trying to chase their form of perfection.
Can I pick you up on that? Because a lot of people would say, you're not chasing perfection. This is a dumpster truck fire at the moment, isn't it? I mean, just the shape of this bill and where your party is on it looks incredible. The amount of money that's being spent, the amount of effort that's being spent for sending no one, but a maximum, even if it happened, of 200 people.
Well, I think, as I say, it's there as a deterrent. That's the key thing for it. It's not just a wraparound refugee policy. It's trying to stop the boats. Now, you can quite happily agree with you that the fact that we are stuck on just solely talking about stopping the boats, which is really, really important for many people around the country, but it's not the only thing that people have got to worry about.
Obviously, I know you've been doing other things this morning, you've made that clear, but we've just had this statement from Mark Francois MP. He, famous of the Brexit moments, now back on the Rwanda bill, and this is what he said. The government would be best advised to pull the bill and to come up with a revised version that works better than this one, which has so many holes in it. What do you say to Mark Francois?
And the ERG, presumably.
Yeah, I think, look, he needs to look again, because no bill is going to be perfect. And as I said, if it goes to where he wants to go, Rwanda will pull out of the deal anyway, so he won't get that through. He won't get through the House of Lords. I mean, bearing in mind we're talking about, are we going to get through the House of Commons? The House of Lords, we do not have a majority. And if we're going one way or another, then, this isn't going to get off the ground. We've got to... This is about the only thing you're going to get now.
But he is the chair of that group, and there are more than 29 members of the ERG. If the group is following what he's saying now, I pull the bill, Rishi's gone and lost the vote.
Well, I don't know about the actual numbers of the ERG, because there are lots of people that are loosely attached to it and informally around it, so I don't know who the core is. But, I think they need to have a discussion this afternoon with number 10, because, as I say, really is the only game in town. I hate to use that because it's not a game. This is serious stuff, and I think if he's talking about pulling it because he's going to vote against it, then I don't see where we go with that.
What's your message to ERG members who are listening to what their chair is saying now about pulling the bill then?
Have that discussion with number 10, but when it comes to second reading, it's the principle of the bill. Do you agree with the principle of the bill? I think they do, so they should vote for it.
So take me through the politics of this, because it just, James cleverly was right, not when he called it batshit, but maybe some people would say he was right calling it batshit, but when he said it's not the be all and end all. It's one of many different policies, and yet Rishi Sunak has put all his chips on the casino on this policy. He's staking his premiership, it feels like, on getting this bill passed, when, as Emily says, it's maximum 200 people will be going to Rwanda next year. It seems politically
really
crazy.
it's zero.
Yeah.
But even if it worked, it would be maximum 200.
Look, the pledges that the Prime Minister set out at the beginning of the year, he set himself a year to get through these. And clearly this isn't going to get through this year. It's going to be after Christmas, so he's not going to get it done by December. But it was always the most challenging. The pledges were set out in a particular order. It wasn't just sort of like random, interchangeable. It was sort of done in, people talking about the economy. We had to fix the economy. People obviously talking about the NHS. We have to try and cut the waiting lists on the NHS. This is probably the most intractable one of all of those 5. But if you look at immigration, whether it's legal immigration or illegal immigration in this instance, you've got to look wider than just trying to stop the boats, because why are people moaning about this in the first place? Yes, there's a sense of fairness. They don't want people coming across, and maybe seemingly jumping in the queue, as some people would say. They want to remove the human traffickers and the misery that's coming across the channel, but it's also about infrastructure. And if we're not talking about housing, we're not talking about jobs, and we're not talking about that wider issue, which has a wider impact than just immigration.
Right. But that's the thing. You could be talking about the 750,000 legal immigrants that they also want to cut down on. You could be talking about the deterrents that come from working with other governments like, Brussels or France or Albania, as has been so successful. I'm just trying to work out from you, Paul, do you agree that it looks slightly obsessive at the moment? I keep thinking of that episode of Breaking Bad where the fly is just like going round and round and round, and you can't take your eye off the fly. It feels like Rishi Sunak's got this in his brain right now. He just can't let it go, can't move on.
I'm not sure it's obsessive, but it very much risks being insular if we just don't get off this circle, if we don't get that fly off the screen as quickly as possible, because people are busy cooking eggs. They're only looking at headlines, and so they're sitting there thinking, okay, fine, immigration, massive issue, but what affects me is my school, my hospital, my job prospects, these kind of things.
So is Rishi being badly advised then to make so much of this particular issue because it's drowning everything else out?
I don't know in terms of how his advice, where we've come through to that narrow point of the funnel, as it were, but I don't think he's going to be able to. It was always, when you set out the pledges, no party can win an election if you're not just sorting out the problems, but setting out the aspiration for the next 5 years, the hopes for the next 5 years, that vision. People talk about, is the next election going to be a 92 or 97 election? Actually, it risks being a 1945 election where, we've done all this stuff with these huge issues around COVID, around the war in Ukraine, etc. And we're largely tackling those sort of things. But then people are saying, yeah, but what about the next 5 years? Churchill had just won a war. Nobody gave him thanks. It's actually say, yes, but these guys are going to build me houses.
1945 is a pretty alarming example for the Conservative Party if you're comparing
only so much
to 1945 when Labour swept to power.
I just say, people don't give you thanks for what you've done. It's about what you're going to do. And actually, if you haven't done what you're saying you're going to do, people aren't going to listen to you about the next 5 years. That's my key point, I think.
So do you think he's got the numbers for tomorrow, Paul? What's your sense?
I would think yes. I would be really disappointed if people actually broke ranks tomorrow for the reasons that I've said. Tomorrow is a debate about the principle of the bill. And I think the vast majority of the Conservative Parliamentary Party think this is the policy that we need to get round. They're arguing over where you pull it in terms of the detail over it. And as I've said before, the Prime Minister's been really clear, and I agree with him, that if you go one way, Rwanda pull out anyway. If you go the other way, you don't really have a policy because it's too weak and it's just going to end up in the courts forever anyway.
You started by saying that you were going to vote with Rishi Sunak tomorrow. You feel loyal. You talk about your party, your government. A lot of our listeners will remember that until a month ago, you were right in the heart of government. You were a minister. You lost your job. You lost your position there. Does that, just to sort of take us behind the curtain, does that affect how you feel at all? Does it affect your sense of loyalty, or do you sort of think, well, why am I working so hard? No,
I'm a conservative through and through. I've never been a joiner. I'm never worried about big organisations or stuff like that. It's just, am I following my principles? And I always have a high bar for attacking governments. That's why I was sitting there talking to you guys through, Boris's reign, through Liz Truss's reign, through Theresa May's reign, premierships.
Yeah.
Because you should set a high bar for governments to
can I ask you,
should only happen at the general election.
So when you look at your sort of former colleagues like Robert Jenrick or Suella Braverman, who've been very outspoken as soon as they've left about everything that Rishi Sunak is doing wrong, do you think that's disloyal? I mean, how do you read that?
Look, I think people should be able to speak reasonably freely within the sense of you don't have the same collective responsibility as when you're not a minister, but you still have the collective team. If you like, if we're going to, have a conservative principles in government, then you obviously have to have a team. You can't have, 300 odd people just going rogue and doing their own thing. But it's important that people should first of all be able to speak truth to power. Second, be able to speak to you guys as freely as we can. But thirdly, make sure that we actually. We're doing it for the right reasons, and we're not just playing for ourselves post-general election and sort of raking over the bones of what may happen. This is, for me, I'm not a career politician. I came into this almost by accident. Funnily enough, in 1997, I was that guy that joined the party 2 weeks after the general election. Here's £25 and you need more than I do. And so I'll happily, if I was to lose or choose to do something else, I'll go off and do something else. I always do this job whilst I can add value. That's the thing for me. It's not about a career.
Paul Scully, great fun to have you here. Thank you for coming in.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much. So we've discussed Rishi Sunak's vanishing WhatsApp messages in the introduction to this episode.
Can we just have a moment's silence
for the vanishing
Rishi Sunak's vanished WhatsApp messages?
Yeah, because when you change your phone, isn't there a thing? What are those things? White fluffy things in the sky? A cloud. That's it. Isn't there a thing called the cloud?
Even if you're not in the cloud. I can offer you that. Even if you're not in the cloud, you can still keep most of the data on your phone if you transfer.
The other thing that, of course, that has been discussed and is the main purpose of the discussion at the COVID inquiry today is Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme to kind of revive the catering industry, restaurants that were absolutely on their knees after lockdown, and the consequences of that, and how much consultation he had, if any, with the scientists about introducing this policy.
And they had ample opportunity to raise those concerns between the announcement of the scheme and its implementation. None of them chose to do so in any fora that they were in. And I think all of them have said on the record, as the evidence also conclusively demonstrates, that this was in way, no shape or form responsible for a second wave, which was predicted by the CMO and CSA as early as my first conversation with them in March, and happened in every other country in Europe.
So I guess there are two bits here. One is the policy, and one, as you say, was how much he listened to the scientists. And there is a sense that's come out of what he said today that he felt the scientists had too much influence over decision-making during the pandemic, and that maybe ministers weren't allowed to give enough weight to the economic and social impact or consequences of lockdown. And the one thing I'd say is that I genuinely think that was a decision made in good faith at the time when it seemed like this would help in what he thought would be a post-COVID era. And I think quite a lot of what we've heard from the inquiry is people scrabbling around to explain what a genuinely awful, chaotic place Downing Street was at the time, right? I mean, whether it was Dominic Cummings, whether it was Lee Kane, whether it was Boris Johnson, whether it was Matt Hancock, they all basically took us inside a world which was utter chaos, unfathomable chaos, where nobody took responsibility, nobody put their hand up to decisions, nobody seemed to be in charge of anything, and quite a lot of lying went on at the same time. The fact that Rishi Sunak actually takes responsibility for that, explains his actions, and says, look, yes, we can see the numbers did go up. I understand that. Retrospectively, at least he took a stance on a policy.
I think the other thing about the testimony that he's given today is it absolutely mirrors the written evidence that he submitted. hasn't gone beyond it. And, any lawyer who is briefing someone to appear in court, don't give any more information than you need to. Answer the questions in a minimalist sense. Don't go maximalist, because if you go maximum, you open up new avenues and you go off script.
Well, this speaks to the WhatsApp messages, because essentially he is not a man, clearly, very comfortable with writing things down. So if he knew that things were written down that he didn't want, better if those WhatsApp messages disappear. Everything else that's written down, he will stick by. So actually, what you keep hearing from Rishi Sunak is, oh, well, I wasn't much of a communicator by WhatsApp. I think that is quite important, because probably it's a skill he will have learned as a politician or as a Goldman Sachs banker, that anything written down can be used as evidence against you. So he didn't write it down.
There's another part about this COVID inquiry that maybe we could just talk about briefly, because I've been struck by the number of senior politicians, serving, former, from both parties, who say, what the hell is the COVID inquiry for? Is it just about score settling, which is great for journalists because it gives us a lot to talk about the chaos, about the dysfunction, about what was going on inside Downing Street and the kind of clash of personalities and the kind of fear and loathing that was going on? Or is there any kind of wider purpose to this inquiry and when it will publish?
I'm surprised that you say that you've heard it from both parties or from both sides, because I have heard that recurringly now from what I would call government ministers or government party MPs as a way of basically trying to sideline what is going on in that inquiry right now. I mean, that seems to be the narrative that has been adopted, which is not a million miles away from, oh, that trial's a bit of a witch hunt, or, oh, that parliamentary committee doesn't know what it's doing, or it's overreached. I think we have to remember that when Boris Johnson put that to Hugo Keith last week, Hugo Keith, the KC, turned to him and said, I am following the remit you set for this inquiry. So within the parameters of what they've been asked to do, they are doing it. And yes, at the moment, it probably is trying to work out who is responsible for what decisions at what point. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so necessarily.
I suppose the question I'm asking is this about the lessons that need to be learned, about the preparedness that we need to have as a nation for a future pandemic or a future medical emergency crisis that, threatens in the same way that COVID-19 did? Or is it much more about the decisions that were taken? Rishi did this, Boris did that, and the chaos and the dysfunction. And I just think that what's coming out of it for most people at this stage, if you say what's happened at the COVID inquiry, they'll say, well, God, they are a bunch of clowns.
Well, maybe that's a lesson. Don't put Boris Johnson in charge of a pandemic. And I think, going back to that line from Boris Johnson last week, when he said, I got the big calls right. How you govern is not about the two big calls. It's every single small bit of advice you are given, or the details, or the briefs you read, or the notes. Every small decision mounts up to part of a bigger decision. And I think to have somebody who didn't get that, who didn't think it was important to read the minutes, who didn't think it was important to actually inform scientists before a decision was taken, who didn't think it was very important that he sort of stayed within the parameters of the very rules and the laws that he had set, I think that does tell you something. It does tell you something about our preparedness, which is, as we said before, don't just get the boosterist optimists in charge. Get somebody who understands that big decisions come from a whole series of correct small decisions that are taken along the way.
And in a moment, we're going to come back sort of to Rwanda, sort of to Gary Lineker, and sort of to the BBC and what it does now. So Gary Lineker has signed a joint letter saying that the government should reverse its Rwanda policy. Now, some people say, well, is that the right side or the wrong side of the new BBC social media guidelines that came after his attack back in kind of earlier on this year about Suella's cruel policies.
About the same policy.
So he's been consistent, but he's got involved in chat on social media, which kind of looks slightly more dodgy in terms of the new guidelines and is in some ways a throwing down of the gauntlet to Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, saying, so what you going to do now, Tim?
And His tweet was something that Grant Shapps was asked about on his media round this morning. The Defence Secretary said that Gary Lineker should stick to football, stay away from expressing political views, and that he was on a collision course with the BBC. Gary Lineker then responded to Grant Shapps by saying, "At least I don't have 4 different personalities," and a picture of all the names that Grant Shapps had used or called himself. I mean, that is fairly on target of one personality, which is again breaking the BBC guidelines.
Yeah, let me give you another, just the context of what the guidelines say. Jonathan Gullis MP wrote, "Yet another breach of the BBC's impartiality rules by Gary Lineker," to which Gary Lineker replies, "Jonathan hasn't read the new guidelines, or, should I say, had someone read them to him." In other words, suggesting that Jonathan Gullis can't read for himself, he's illiterate. The guideline says, let me just read you the guideline. Section 4B.2 of the new BBC social media rules says, "Don't criticise the character of individual politicians in the UK." Now, what he did with Grant Shapps and what he's done with Jonathan Gullis comes pretty close. And so you've now got a situation where Tory MPs, who have been divided over everything to do with Rwanda, are now saying to Tim Davie, "What are you going to do about Gary Lineker?"
Yeah.
Again.
I do think there are sort of 2 sides to this story. One is whatever happens to that relationship between Gary Lineker and the BBC, whether Gary Lineker is now looking for a way out, or he's trying to, cut ties with the BBC, or whether the BBC feels that this is sort of, one gauntlet too far and has to have that whole row again. But as you say, the more interesting one is how it could now unify people towards that vote tomorrow. The unintended consequence of people like Gary probably signing a letter, 30-strong sort of celebrity letter against the Rwanda policy, is that if you are part of a divided party, you suddenly decide that you're not as divided as you are with the people you can see having signed the letter and maybe, in brackets, having broken BBC guidelines. I wonder whether it will have a galvanising effect on what looks at the moment to be a very divided party.
Emily and I won't be here tomorrow.
No.
Well-deserved day off.
Very well-deserved, yes.
Ish. Lewis will be here. But we'd love to get your questions on what you think are the main issues of 2023 so we can have a whole bonus episode of your questions and our feeble attempts at an answer.
Yeah, sort of recipes.
Yeah.
Colours. Pets, pet names.
What is your favourite colour?
I'm just asking for something nice and gentle.
Oh.
I don't want like legislative conundrums when we record. I don't think my head is up to it right now.
The Maitlis and Sopel Star Chamber. I think that's got a ring to it. Please send your questions to newsagents@global.com.
You get a free hoodie.
You get a free hoodie?
No, I just made that up. I can't even access the free hoodies.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.